This video is going to take you through exactly how you can calculate an estimate for how long your animation will take to make. This is how we're going to calculate a 2-minute animation. We're going to calculate how long it's going to take. And I'm going to walk with you step by step through the stages and how I got to this calculation. You can't just take this number and it's yours, because it's going to be different for everyone who does this, but I'm going to show you how you can calculate it for yourself. This model is for independent animators only. For studios, it can be a lot more complex because you're working in collaboration with other people. You might have to work to their schedules. There's a lot more that comes into the mix, but even then, this would be a good foundation to start with, or some kind of adaptation of this model. But just keep that in mind. This is for a solo independent animator working on his own film, whether it's commission or whatever. We work our way down these and do the calculations as we go down. Each calculation informs our next calculation. So we're going to start with seconds. So we're just going to take the 2 minutes here, convert that into seconds. So that's 120 seconds. So then we've got frames. So we've got to break it down into frames. Let's say that our frame rate for our video is going to be 24. So 24 frames per second. I'm going to use the calculator because I'm not going to pretend I'm good at maths. Now, this is an interesting one, the frame rate. So, as you know, as a 2D animator, and this is for 2D animation, not for 3D animation. 3D animation would require a completely different model. For 2D animation, we don't draw all the frames. Unless you're Richard Williams and you have some poor intern working at your studio who's slaving away on your in-betweens and getting it all onto ones, you do not animate on ones typically. Especially if you're working in anime or you know, internet animations in general. It's not going to be 24 frames per second. You're going to break that down. So you're going to either be animating on ones if it's 24 frames per second, 2s, 3s, 4s. You probably wouldn't go beyond 4s or 5s as an average. That depends actually, because you might have certain establishing shots. Like for me, I like to provide an establishing shot at the start, and for that there won't be any frames, you know, it will just be a still image. You could take that into account as well to get your average, but for me, mine would probably average out at 3 on 3s. So the frame rate will be 8 frames per second. We use that to get our next one, total drawings. What we can do to get that is we take the amount of frames that are going to go through. So let's say in our editor or in the actual video file itself, there are going to be this many frames on an animation that lasts exactly 2 minutes, right? Now, with the frame rate, an 8 frames per second one, that will divide that number by 3. So I'm going to divide that by 3. So now we've got 960 total drawings. That includes the effects animation. So if you've got a layered animation with like, let's say a guy splashing about in a river, the drawing is the character, but it's also the water. It's any kind of effects animation on top of that. So if you are wanting to have a very effects heavy animation, maybe you want to take that into consideration, you might want to play with this number. Okay, so you might want to bump it up a bit, or like in the case with the establishing shot, you might want to bump it down a bit. You bump it up, down, as many calculations as you can to arrive at that number. But for now, to simplify it, I'm just going to say it's 960. It's a very simplified model, but you can actually make it as complex as you want. You can factor in your effects animation. And these parts here get really interesting. So I've got a big asterisk by this one. This is storyboard and pre-production work. I'm just going to factor them all into this, right? I'm going to make them, in the next one, I'm going to make them all average out at an average time per drawing. I would say if you're doing your pre-production work properly and your storyboard work for a 2-minute animation, so for your storyboard work for a 2-minute animation, you probably have, on average, a new storyboard frame every 3 seconds. On average. Might be more detailed, might be less detailed, but I'm going to say on average every 3 seconds. I'd even bump that up to every 2 seconds. For that, we take the 120, we halve that, so we've got 60. So we add an extra 60 frames on for the storyboard. For the pre-production, I would say for a decent pre-production on a 2-minute film, but I would say realistically about 100 drawings. You can stretch this number or squash it as much as you want. So with those two combined, with the storyboard and the drawings, we've got 160 drawings added on. Those are quite intense drawings. You're actually doing a lot of thought process. You're going to be looking at references. They would take you longer. Total drawings would actually be 960 plus 160. So 1120 is our new total drawings once we take into account the storyboard and the pre-production. For this, we're just going to average them all out. So average time per drawing is the next one. My advice is to take a sheet of paper, set a timer, press go, and draw your character. Draw the main character and maybe draw two of the other characters in there. Of course, I always advise that you keep the amount of characters as low as possible. You can see how long it takes for me to draw a character. I think if you did it, you'd actually be surprised of how long it can take. A fully rendered image, it can take a long time. Taking into account things like in-between time is going to be a lot less. So half of these are going to be in-betweens. You've got to remember, half of your total drawings are probably going to be in-betweens, maybe even more than half. But then some of them, like your storyboard and pre-production, are going to take you a long time, like an hour. Back to the average time per drawing, I'm just going to say, with all those kind of things taken into account, of course I'm rushing this to make it simple, but I would say 15 minutes. That is cutting it quite close, I would say. It's not very generous, but it's an average and it's a guess. That's a really important point though, average time per drawing. So you might want to take more time to actually work that out for yourself. If you sit down per day, and this is an average, how many drawings can you get through per day? Let's say you're working 8-hour days. 8 hours minus 2 hours for contingency time, lunchtime and things like that. So you've got 6 hours. So let's say you can get an average of 24 drawings per day. Now that I say that out loud, 24 drawings per day, that actually sounds like a lot. That sounds like an awful lot. But we'll put it down, okay? 24 per day. Actually, no. Let's bring it down. That's a lot. You've got weekends and things. You've got life. If you might have a life, you might not. I mean, you are an animator, so I don't know. Maybe you don't have a life, but I certainly do. I socialize with friends. I go to the gym and all of that kind of stuff. Maybe you'll be ill. You know, there's so many different things you can take into consideration for the drawings per day. This is kind of what your productivity rate is going to be. So as you approach the deadline, here's the deadline. There's your deadline, there's your start. Productivity, it stays pretty low for quite a long time. And then you'll reach this point where you're able to finally see, oh God, we've got so much to do. And then it's going to rocket up like this. And in the last few days, you're going to pull like some all-nighters and stuff, and it's going to be really productive. So that's kind of what your productivity graph will look like. Something like that. It would be a steep upward curve. That gets into a principle called Parkinson's law. Back to the calculations. So we've got drawings per day, 20. We've got the total drawings. This is an important number here. I'm trying to get ink into the pen, sorry. And then we've got drawings per day. So using those two numbers from before, we can now calculate the amount of days it's going to take you. 56. Let's see if I can get another pen. So 56 days is the calculation. Now I look at that 56 days. I think that's a bit tight. You've got to work in contingency time, and contingency time is just all the stuff you don't see coming. Things in the calculations that we haven't thought of. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of things like that. An easy trick is just multiply it by 2 on 12, and then you've also got a multiplication by 3. And this is the number that I give to clients. I give the times 3. So if a client is saying, like, we'd like to work with you, how long would it take? You know, we can pay you and everything, how long would it take? I would give them 168. And that is just to be on the safe side, guys. The more you create, the more you realize there is to do where you didn't realize it before. So this is a nice safe number now. So you've got the kind of 3 tiers here. You've got the Risktaker tier, which is the first one, 56 days. That's like if you are prepared to no life it, you can do it in 56 days. If you want to be much more safe, much more calculated, and to have a life at the same time, but still to work hard every day, then the multiplication by 2, 112 days is great. If you want to be really safe because you're working with other people's money, you've got to really make sure that when you say you can deliver it, that is the day you can deliver it. Well, then you got 168 there. The whole story, I want to have it boils down to the essence and to just show that, because animation takes so long. You don't want the extra fluff, but you can also use this method to calculate any amount. Even a feature-length film, you could calculate this, although I would probably times that by 5. The pre-production you would need for that alone would just be massive. Here's a very simple graph here, detail/quality and time. You can have something that's really detailed, but it's going to take more time. It's stuck to this sort of linear graph. You can have something that's really rushed, and it's not going to take you that much time. So within this thing here, based on this important one here, average time per drawing, that's what it all comes down to, really. So if you do have things like an animation competition, and they say you've only got 1 week to make a 1-minute animation, well, you pull out all the stops. Any kind of detail that doesn't need to be there, you take it out. You can have like an advanced animatic for it that's not fully animated. You know, that kind of thing will take you not much time at all. 1-minute animation, you can make that in a week. You know, if you've got two people as well working on it during over a week, you can make a detailed animatic that's going to show a story, and you can do it very quickly. So this is a very flexible number, very flexible indeed. Going back to this, Parkinson's law is basically whatever amount of time you set for yourself to achieve a goal, you will fill that time. So if you set yourself a year to make a 2-minute animation, you would take a whole year to make it. You'd probably still have to rush at the end because you'd miscalculate, but you would get it finished. Now, if you set yourself a month to make a 1-minute or 2-minute animation, you would make it within a month. It might be a slightly low quality one, but you would make it. I've made a 1-minute animation in a month before. It was very intense work, but I got it finished, and it's actually one of the animations that I'm most proud of today. So I actually recommend setting a fairly short deadline for these things. That's my method. You know, some people like to really polish their work for a long time. I don't. Okay, yeah, this is a really important point. That will really help you, okay? If you've already made an animation in your past, you can kind of reverse engineer how long it will take you for your next one. I made this animation called Meet the Sky animation, and I made it all by myself. I worked flat out, I worked very hard on it, and it took me 5 months. It was a 4.5-minute animation, and it took 5 months to make. From that, we can work out a sort of formula, and then we can use that for any amount. So let's say I'm trying to calculate a 10-minute animation. Well, we work out that you can't see that, can you? I hope you can see that. We work out what it takes per minute of animation. So that's 4.5. Hold on. I'm getting confused here. Hold on. 5 months divided by 4.5 is 1.1111 per minute. So I worked out that 10-minute animation, judging by Meet the Sky, will take 11 months. Think of how long it took you before, and you can work out from there how long it will take you moving forward. So always use past work as a guide reference point. As well as that, like there, it's not deceiving you. That's how long it took. You know that for a fact. More than that, you even know how difficult it was. You know, how intensely were you working during that time. You know that because you remember. So that's a really good method. I've got another graph to show you. This is a really important one. It's really hard to erase this. Changing this graph. We had the storyboard and pre-production in there with the other drawings, the other animation drawings. But that might not actually be the most effective way to go about it. Let's say this is your progress. Progress and time. Again. Alright, so we've got this line. Now, if you bunch them all into just drawings, right? You start, you draw, you go through pre-production, you go through production and post-production, but they're all in there with the same process. You don't plan out any time. Your progress could look like anything, you know, it'll be a wobbly line to the top, okay? And somewhere along there, you'll have had to make the decision to move on from pre-production to production to post-production. What I would suggest is to create deadlines. So draw a line through and say on this day, we stop pre-production and we move into production. On this day here, this is our deadline for production. Production needs to have finished and we go into post-production, which can be, you know, bringing them all into Premiere, doing color grading, that kind of thing. So especially with pre-production, I recommend that you have an inner deadline that you stick to, an inner deadline for pre-production. Maybe it's more like here, or maybe it's even here, you know. You have a massive time for pre-production and then you just go and execute. Maybe you're really fast at executing, you don't need much time for that, but pre-production is really important. So it should have its own dedicated time. So that's an amendment to this really. It's a different way of going about it and I actually recommend it more. 2 quick tips to make your process quicker and more efficient. During this pre-production phase here, take one scene, so you're in your pre-production phase, but for that one scene, you take that through all the way to post-production and you finish it. So during your pre-production, you have a scene, you know, you've taken it from storyboard, you've animated it fully, you've colored it, you've composited it, that's your character. You've animated it, you've composited it, and it's there now. That's a really good method because there, what you have to do in your pre-production, you have to go through the whole process and you work out along the way all the obstacles that are in your way. Especially if you're entering a new medium. Let's say you're doing a watercolor animation. Well then in pre-production, it's really important to first try it with one scene and learn what you're going to need to do moving forward. After that, what I would recommend is for you to batch your processes as much as possible. And that's because when you change processes, let's say you're doing BG and then you're doing animation, it'd probably be the other way around, but whatever, editing. Whenever you switch tasks to a different task, the process of switching takes time. You have to close the application and load up a new one. That takes time. So really, you want to move through these as few times as possible. And you do that by batching your processes. With the exception of your trial scene, your first test scene, which will be in your pre-production where you move through all the processes. So I hope this video has helped you with your questions for how long an animation takes. Now you have some tools that you can use to calculate it for yourself if you're a producer or if you're an independent animator. Hopefully this should clear some of the mystery of how you can calculate it. See you in the next video. Goodbye. If you have difficult questions like this that you want a personalized answer to, I offer one-to-one tutoring and consulting. So if this is something that would interest you, go to animatorguild.com/workshops to find out more about this service that I'm offering. Thank you very much to my patrons for helping to fund this video. Link to my Patreon account is in the description. I'd really appreciate it if you guys check it out.